So, hello.
Hello.
Not all at once, I'll get scared. So, modularize all the things now including CSS. We've had a lot of quite in-depth module talks and component talks, so that's quite interesting. Let's see how my slightly more high-level approach will feel, because I think everybody's kind of drowsy and looking forward to drinks, so I'll try and keep it light, keep it brief. So, as Paul said, I'm Lewis Cowper, both here and on the internet. I'm a junior front-end dev at HitFox in Berlin. We're at HitFox Tech Dev, and that's our Foxy logo. So, yeah, let's get back to the good stuff. So I'm here tonight to talk about modularizing things, and why you might want to. Now, I know a lot, well, the previous two talks have kind of said, hey, modules are great. Let's move on. So I thought we'd kind of explore why people might think in modules and why that may be helpful for you. And no matter what level of applications that you look at, the trends that come out just now are all built around making a single bit that you can either deploy in the case of containers, or slightly now old-fashioned case VMs, or an API that has a single thing that it does and it does it well. You don't make one API call that then triggers a whole load of state change in your app. You make one API call and you expect one thing back. And it kind of tries to make it easier to work with and tries to make your system more general purpose, which is quite nice. And this part of system design and systems architecture really fascinates me, and as I've been trying to dive into more web development topics, a big part of that becomes learning how and when to refactor. Like just in any development, right? So whenever you might think, oh hey, I'm using this function twice, is that worth it? And then you think, well, in 6 months when I need to use it 18 different times, it might actually make sense to refactor. And in order to try and explain that, I went on Wikipedia, and as you often do if you go to enough pages, you wind up in philosophy. And during procrastinating writing this talk, I wound up looking up reductionism for whatever reason, but it turns out it's actually quite good, although it is apparently one of the most used and abused terms in the philosophical lexicon. But it's a kind of multiple catch-all philosophical umbrella term for anything regarding the connections between events and how they happen. And usually it's reducing a large set of events into one event so that you can more easily understand it. So there's these things called phenomena in philosophy, which is a physical or mental but specific and deliberate action. And these can create epiphenomena. So you have a beer, you put your beer down, suddenly it spills. That wouldn't have happened if you hadn't got beer, etc., etc. The epiphenomena is you've knocked over your beer and now there's beer everywhere. You didn't throw beer everywhere, but the same end result applies. And I kind of thought, wait a minute, I've heard this before. This is functional programming and side effects, right? This is Redux. This is reduce all the unintended side effects of your code. And it started making me think about how we think of how you design a web application and behavior both in the overall system sense and at the really macro level when you're narrowing in on why a function doesn't quite do what you want. So in philosophy, unfortunately, we diverge because we've got a different kind of mental model. And in philosophy, there's an implication that the stuff that arises out of your deliberate actions have no agency and no purpose and no control over the original actions. Whereas sometimes in programming they do. And I feel like we've got a few kind of core phenomena in any web development because we have a technology that we have to use in any web development, which is CSS. Your CSS, whether pre-processed or not, your markup, and by extension your class and ID structure and the semantic structure of your of the DOM that you generate, the browser that the user is using to view your web page in, any plugins, ad blockers, etc., or the device itself, they're all epiphenomena that you have to cater for as part of your job. You have to use media queries and user agent sniffing. You have to do feature tests before you just blindly apply to local storage, for example. Well, that's getting better. And that's not to mention things that are neither your users nor your control, things like ad networks injecting JavaScript in your page, slowing down slowing down page load, and other web content that you rely on. And the whole construction of the DOM and the CSS object model and the visuals of the web page are the epiphenomena of the phenomenon of you writing code. We should be able to go from one to the other if we know the fundamental phenomena. We should be able to take the input files, your build process, and achieve the same output. That's kind of expected. So, a lot of the time, when people do CSS, I've heard it many, many times. I know a lot of pretty hardcore functional programmers that happen to be writing JavaScript, and they hate CSS. CSS is the worst possible thing, the worst possible implementation, the most poorly spec'd, worst. Oh, it's terrible. And it's totally not. It's fine. You're just not using it right. Because in order to do CSS properly, and I say that with all the inverted air quotes in the world, you have to know every single thing that happens CSS-wise in your app, right? If you cause a reflow, layout jitter, web font, flash of unstyled content, or even worse, a flash of styled content that then gets overwritten, that's because you've seen, how do I load web font into a page, for example, you've done it, and then all of a sudden, the rendering completely changes. And it's the cascade, it's the C in CSS, and it's the global nature of CSS. And this is usually the point where we slap in an exclamation mark important, or just shove a class in at the end of the file, nobody will notice, it'll be fine. And the problem is that we need to figure out the minimum amount of code that we need to change in order to achieve our result. We need to figure out the smallest phenomenon that will result in the epiphenomena that we want. And as I'm comparably new to learning about CSS, and most of the people who I've gone to for programming advice have been JavaScript programmers who told me stay away from it, it's kind of difficult, right? It's a difficult process to learn CSS from nothing. You go in, you can learn HTML5 in a few days. You can kind of have a mastery of tags and stuff. You can go into JavaScript, you can alert in like 2 minutes. You use one word, one set of brackets, the semicolon's optional, you're done. But CSS, as it turns out, if you only know half of it, there's a whole other half that you don't know. And there's even more than that that's in your application, because it's a set of child selectors, adjacent selectors, sibling selectors. There's a whole host of other weird things that you then need to figure out before you can figure out how that's supposed to look and how it does look now. So I've heard of a lot of different acronyms for organizing CSS, BEM, SMACSS, ITCSS suit. Has anybody heard of any of these? That's more like it. I like good logos. So these are architectural patterns that you can use, but that are never ever enforced by any configuration ever, unless you specifically set up tests to do it. But what if there was a way to do that? What if there was a way to set up your build process or your testing process that meant that every class that you wrote was namespaced by default? It had all of the component that it had, the component that it came from, it had the class that you were applying, and you would be guaranteed that that was local. You would be guaranteed that the CSS that you were working on was a CSS that was going to wind up rendering the component. And that's really cool, and there's been a few fantastic, almost entirely Australian, I don't know why they think about things in a different way, team working on CSS modules. And their kind of goal was that if you can't keep your HTML's CSS dependencies in your head, you're going to have a bad time. So the goal was to codify that, to make that really, really explicit. And I saw Robert, wherever he's vanished, somewhere. Oh, he's there. Hey, you were talking about Webpack requiring CSS, so presumably using CSS loader, which is a really cool tool, and you should definitely look into it. But with CSS modules, you want to create the modules in parallel to the components, and you don't want to have to include stuff that you don't need to. So you can do it with regular CSS, and that's fine. But CSS modules is a very, very, very small addition to CSS that allows you to do that. So here are some of the goals of the internal architecture of good CSS, regardless of whether you're using modules, whether you're using SASS, less, raw CSS, whatever. Style should be scoped to a single component, but all CSS selectors are global, so we should have a convention for ensuring globally unique selectors. That's a problem Ben tries to solve with the block element modifier syntax. Whenever you have a block, you then have an element inside it, and you can then modify it, which is fine. But because it's a convention, not programmatically controlled, it's really difficult because, as it turns out, naming things is hard. So one of the fundamental features of the Webpack loader, which is also core to JSPM and easily possible with Browserify, is the ability to explicitly describe each file's dependencies regardless of the type of source file. You can slap JSON in there, slap CSS in there, slap JavaScript in there, it doesn't matter. It'll take care of it. So you can specify your CSS as a dependency and it's guaranteed to be present, much like any other dependency. But with great power comes great responsibility. And this is where the new spec comes in. So CSS modules allows you to treat CSS variables that you create using nothing but CSS as objects in JavaScript. So this sounds kind of weird, but okay. So we've kind of seen this syntax in Robert's talk where you require and then you can also then add a variable to that require statement, which means the return value of require my component CSS becomes bound to the styles attribute. So with CSS, you just get a big object, which is fun. That's weird. Oh yeah, cool. It was just a weird order. So in order to help out with that, there's interoperable CSS, which is in the CSS modules GitHub organization. And basically what it does is add import and export pseudo classes into CSS. But you never ever need to worry about them if you're using CSS modules. But the important thing is that the two techniques, while used in parallel, can be really helpful. If you can think of another reason why you might want to use an import statement in your CSS or an export statement, you can do it, and that's fine. And it doesn't have to be CSS module specific. So interoperable CSS, to read because I can never remember the proper definition, is a specification that describes the mechanism by which the imported symbols are passed around before they get to your JavaScript component. And that's way too dense and long, so let's go back to CSS modules. And yes, that is the official logo. So yeah, it's a new project that builds upon the work that people who want to control CSS styling in JavaScript, but with the express purpose of not sacrificing all the cool things about CSS. So everything inside a CSS module is local by default. Each file gets compiled separately, so your selectors can be whatever you like. They can be completely generic to the button. You could just have a normal, an error, a disabled. Yeah, I'm going to go on to that. The compilation will take care of the actual names of your classes, and we can take advantage of interoperable CSS's import and export pseudo selectors in our build process, so we never need to think about it. So with suit or BEM naming, I think the only difference is suit capitalizes the components. Like literally, if anybody knows what the actual difference is, feel free to let me know after. But we would have all the styles for normal up here in the button class. Button disabled will then override that to make it look disabled, overrides for error, overrides for in progress. So you wind up having to apply two classes manually in your HTML because button in progress has no concept of what button is, it just knows what styles it needs to override. So with CSS modules, you could have, within components, submit button, you have normal, disabled, error, and in progress, and have all the styles in there. And then, yeah, import styles, styles.normal, it all works the way you would expect. Of note is the fact that all of the styles go into every class, which means that you only need one class to make your component look the way you want. But that sounds like you're going to wind up repeating yourself continuously because you've got a button class that looks like a button, you've got border radiuses, you've got gradients, you've got whatever you want. But this is where a fundamental power of CSS modules that's unrelated to interoperable CSS comes in, which is composition. So this is how you would represent shared styles within CSS modules. So Let's look at some examples. So if common contained all the common styles that you wanted, so border radius, or a gradient that you wanted to apply to everything, and you were only really going to change the background color, the foreground color, what have you, you can just say compose as common, and then add in the specific normal styles. Disabled, compose as common, anything that only applies to disabled. So with your BEM style naming, you would have button and button in progress. When you know that you've got a button, it says it in the tag. That's the one thing that's always bugged me about BEM naming. You've got a big button tag there for accessibility reasons. Why have button twice? But that's another talk. So CSS modules, you would have a button of class and then have styles in progress in there, and then you know that that button is in progress at that point in time. So we have one style, and the namespace is taken care of by the build process, and I'll kind of show you a bit about that at the end. But this composition is actually more powerful than that. It doesn't just compose from a different class within the same file. You can actually do inter-file cooperation and sharing across CSS components. So let's say you had a shared directory of, styles that you wanted available everywhere. You wanted primary and secondary. You've maybe seen it with the brand colors, or some SASS file that just has the big thing where color primary is your main color, color secondary is the accent color, etc., etc. What if you wanted to use that style in another file? With SASS, you've got variables. With CSS, we're actually getting close to getting variables into the spec, so that would be pretty cool. With CSS modules, you can actually choose what you want to export, what you want to import into your new thing. So whenever you update primary, all of your button components change, regardless of the fact that you haven't changed anything in the button. So we can reach into what sound like completely generic files like colors CSS, typography CSS, that kind of thing, and reference the one class that we really want to actually apply, and use the local name for it. It's just primary, because the file system becomes part of how you organize. And to me, that reads really well, but I've not been around the block that many times, so I can at least see that it's definitely extremely powerful. Because composition is essentially a superpower, because it lets you describe what an element is, not what styles make it up. It's a different way of mapping elements to rules. So let's look at some CSS. So this is just some element. It has some styles. It's got font size that you might actually want to change across your entire website. It's got padding, box shadow, etc. So we might actually want to reuse these styles somewhere else. So let's take SASS. Now we've got the exact same result in twice the code. So, yeah, great. And the fact that large font size is for typography, dark text is kind of for colors, padding normal is layout, and then there's a whole mix-in for shadows. The fact that that's there in SASS, it doesn't matter. There's no convention, or there's nothing forcing you to extract those into different files and require them or import them. So when the value of a declaration like box shadow doesn't lend itself to being variable, we have to use a mix-in or extend. So if we use composition, we can declare a component in terms of reusable parts. This is the exact same result, but abstracted away into files. So whenever you want to change an effect on your website, if you want to change a subtle shadow everywhere, you don't need to worry about every single time that you've used subtle shadow. You go into Effects, CSS, and change it. So the CSS modules format kind of naturally lends itself well to having lots of single-purpose files. Each file has a single point of responsibility. Each file changes a specific thing. So how does it look? In your generated HTML in the DOM, you'll actually see something that looks like folder, file name, and then hash with a double underscore in between them. So it will look similar to you. But importantly, that's just a config option. By default, I think this is still the case, the Webpack CSS loader will just put out a hash, which is almost like minifying your class name before you've even started. So let's take a short trip to DevTools. Where is my alt tab? Oh god, should have been mirrored. That would have been much more helpful. So CSS modules webpack demo. That's under css-modules/webpack-demo on GitHub. Oh, great. So in the browser, yeah, you see these app hash. I can't honestly remember what it's a hash of. I did mean to look it up. I think it's the file name or the contents of the file. I have heard two people who should know both say different things. So I don't know. I might make this bigger. It might help. Oh, get away. So yeah, you have this app, logo, app HR, snippet root, app HR. This is all going to make sense in just a moment, I swear. So here is app CSS. So app has app, the class app in app. They should really change that. But it's open source, so I can totally change it. It's fine. And then they have app HR. And then snippet, just to show you another one, has everything that it needs to display the snippets. Snippets here. So everything that it needs to display output and scope selectors, CSS, and then global selectors, all that kind of thing, is all stored in here. All it needs is the class file name, and it does it all for you, and it's really super powerful and super cool. So the cool thing is that you have this, where are we? There we go, class composition. So this actually means, this composes, I'll scroll down to the code so you can maybe see it a bit better. So if you have style variant A, and then put styles.root and styles.text in, you'll get style variant A. And then with, where is it? Oh, it's not even there. That's helpful. So essentially, you can add theming to your components with very little overhead because you just make the whatever you want to change, one file, and then import one style variant A.css or style variant B.css, and it all kind of works. So that's that. So to sum up, I've got 7 minutes. We can do some questions or just have beer early. I don't mind. In short, CSS modules may not be a tool that you immediately run out tomorrow and convert every single project to. But it's definitely a step in the right direction toward making CSS less of a stressful thing, where a few people in your company really understand it, everyone else just kind of hacks. And it allows newcomers to look at your code and understand exactly what's going on. And that's a really cool thing for CSS, because CSS currently doesn't have that thing. It doesn't have a thing where a newcomer can come, look at your component, and figure out exactly what it does until you see it in the page, and until you see your global CSS and see what that's doing. It removes convention and arcane tribal knowledge and acronyms, because I hate acronyms, because they never mean anything. And it removes all that from the burden of the developer and puts it onto the burden of the build tool. That's where it should be. The developer shouldn't care what it's named. The developer just wants to name it and get it done with. Because naming things is like one of the two top problems in computer science, right? Cache and validation, naming things, and off by 1 errors. Is that it? That joke maybe doesn't work in Dutch, I don't know. So the next time you see somebody declaring that CSS is dead, think about how that fear affects people who write CSS. The fear that they're going to break something, the memories of destroying their entire app's layout because they changed the wrong thing. So they get angry, understandably, but then they hate it. They decide that they hate it, and everybody suffers. They inflict their anger-filled viewpoints on the world in Medium posts, and they make innumerable ways to add JavaScript to your CSS instead of adding CSS to your JavaScript. And I think a good way of fighting that is using tools that allow you to use CSS well and attempting to make them better, attempting to popularize them and get them involved. So in the end, for those of you who've seen Star Wars, which I hope is many, CSS, HTML, and JavaScript, and web technology in general is basically the Force. Bear with me. With the right instruction, good mentorship, and a lot of discipline, you can do truly remarkable things, right? You can architect huge things, and you definitely won't take over the world ever. But if all you've got is a convention that maybe you should do this way, it's really easy to let an exclamation mark important slip in. It's really easy to start adding classes to right down near the bottom of the file and hope that nobody notices the diff. It starts becoming the really easy way to hack. And then you start running into more problems, and you hack to get around that. And in case you were not aware, that's the dark side of web. So hopefully the more our tooling can help, and the more likely we are to be able to take steps from the beginning that make it so much easier to be a web Jedi and use our powers for good, the better, right? In short, modularize things, create phenomena instead of relying on epiphenomena. Phenomena, oh, I was so close. This is like the last sentence. I was so close to saying epiphenomena right every time. Thanks very much. Tweet at me if you have questions, or find me with a beer. Or ask questions now. I'm not that fussed. Anyone? Does everyone just want to go and have a drink? A bit of tour? Yeah.